Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Chapter 36, Population Ecology. We're talking about human population. It's the one that's closest to home for us. Current population of the planet is about 7.6 billion. It is projected to increase to about 9.5 billion by mid-century. So by 2050, so within the next 30-ish years. So by the time you're my age, we're going to be knocking on 10 billion people if the growth rate continues. But in the graphic that we saw in the last video, at the end of the last video, we saw that growth rate was slowing down, and that is promising to see that the population of the planet is slowing. But we're still likely to hit this 9.5 billion. Our food production is going to have to double in that amount of time to feed that many more mouths. And you go, well, that's fine. We'll just grow more food. Well, that's actually not quite fine, because growing more food means more farmland. And all the land that we have for farming that's good for farming, not all of it, but most of the land that we have for farming, we're using. We're farming it. So where's all this extra food going to come from? We'll be able to do it. It's fine. But we can't continue to do this. It's going to have to slow down. Expanding populations, which a lot of countries had, are going to need schools for the kids. If they're expanding, that means they have lots of kids. They're going to need schools. They're going to need jobs for these kids. Are going to enter the workforce, and they're going to need lots of new infrastructure. Infrastructure means roads. It means sewers. It means power lines. It means building up the area so that people can live in it. Declining populations, which those countries that went from 6 to 7 kids down to 1 or 2, that's going to be a declining population. Declining populations are going to need lots of medical care, lots of elderly care. And what are we starting to see pop up in a lot of places? In a lot of places, we're starting to see retirement homes. We're starting to see nursing homes pop up. And the reason why is because of the boomer generation, the baby boomers. The baby boom is from about 1945 until about 1965. The baby boom was a boom in the population. That was because really it was due to advances in modern medicine. Vaccinations became very common because kids were getting vaccinated. They didn't die. And so the population grew because fewer people were dying. Fewer kids were dying. Also, post-war, there was a great economy. And if there was a great economy, people had enough money to have more kids. People had lots of kids. So between 1945 and 1965, there's a big boom. Well, then about 1970, we go from most families having 4 to 5 kids at a time to having 2 to 3 kids at a time. And what that meant was these old people that had lots of kids that came from big families now aren't having very many children. And I was told when I was in high school in the 80s that when I got to be my age, when I got to be now, there were going to be more people retired than there were people working. And people that are retired are being paid by the people who are working. Social Security, that's how it works. The people working today are paying the Social Security of the people that retired. And we were told to be terrified. We were told to be scared that there was going to be, we're going to have way too big of a burden to support of all of these retired people. And it's actually starting to come true. That's why Medicare is so expensive. All of the Social Security. That's why everything is so expensive. Because we're having to pay for all these old people. Though, what has saved America? When I was in high school, the population of the U.S. was about 250 million, something like that. We put on about another 100 million since I graduated high school, so the population of the U.S. has increased by half. Most of that is not through children. Most of that was through immigration, people moving to America. And that's what saved us. Immigrants saved my generation and your generation from having to shoulder the burden of paying for my parents and your grandparents. Immigrants saved us, made it so that we could support this huge generation of baby boomers which are retiring right now. Biotic potential is a really interesting idea. Biotic potential is how fast a population can grow given unlimited resources. A population or species biotic potential is going to be different by each different species. But given unlimited resources, how fast can that population grow under ideal conditions? Our hamsters were able to grow at their biotic potential for a little while. What does it kind of feel like humans have been doing for about the past century? You saw that J-shaped curve. What are we doing? For the last century or so, we've been growing at our biotic potential. What's the cause of that? There are a few causes of why the human population has increased so rapidly in the last century. A lot of it has to do with advances in modern medicine. People are living longer. Kids are dying less. It also has a lot to do with fossil fuels. Our country runs off of fossil fuel energy. And what I mean by that is if you are having to plow a field using a mule and a man walking behind it, how much can he do? Supposedly that's what an acre is the definition of. The amount that one person can plow in a day. It was an acre. If you've got a guy and a mule trying to grow enough food for his family, he can only do 1 acre. He can only plow 1 acre a day. So in your planting season of about a month, he can only do about 30 acres. And that is if he's working his butt off. Go from mule and guy walking behind a mule with a plow to a diesel tractor. How much can a diesel tractor plow in a day? And now we're talking about hundreds of acres. And if he can do hundreds of acres in a single day, how many acres can he do in this month-long planting season? Now we're talking about like thousands of acres that it can do. One person can do. Fossil fuel, diesel fuel. Tractors run on diesel fuel. What happens if we run out of diesel fuel? What happens when we run out of oil? Biotic potential. We're currently being able to grow so fast because we can make so much food because we have so much oil. What happens when it runs out? When I was sitting in your chair, when I was in college a long time ago, we were told at that time, 25 years ago, that we had about 50 years worth of oil left. Now, 25 years later, we're still being told there's about 50 years worth of oil left. You're about 20. 50 years worth of oil, how old will you be supposedly when it runs out? What happens then? What happens when there's no more diesel fuel to run tractors? When there's no more diesel fuel to run semis? Because that food that's produced in the farm by diesel fuel is taken to the factory to be made into all of the food that we eat by semi-trucks, which run on diesel fuel. The food that's now done gets taken to the grocery store by more semi-trucks, also powered by diesel fuel. What happens when there's none? Every population can grow only so fast. They can only grow as fast as their limiting factor allows them. What is the limiting factor? It is the one thing that prevents the population from growing any faster. Let's go back to our hamster cage. We've got a hamster cage with enough food for 20, enough water for 20, and let's say that each one needs a little burrow to live in. Each one needs a little nest to live in, and we only have enough nests for 10. What's my limiting factor? There's enough food for 20, there's enough water for 20, but there's only enough nests for 10. So even though there's plenty of food and water, we're not going to have a population much above 10 because there's not enough places for them to live. If we've got enough shelter for 100, if we have enough water for 100, but we only have enough food for 10, what's my limiting factor now? My limiting factor now is food. My population can only be as big as my limiting factor. the one thing that keeps the population from getting any larger. Limiting factor. It's typically food or water, and less so, but it does happen where you're talking about nesting sites, places to raise their babies. Limiting factors.